I think before we dive into the guidelines, what I'd like us to do is just take a moment to set some context. And I want us all to travel back 10 to 15 years. I think anyone who's been on this board is well aware of what has happened in the Sierra-Cascade region in the last 10 years. But I think it's just worth taking a moment to really think about it. um, and so what I want to do is think back to 2012. Before then, and in the early 2000s, I think we were seeing the impacts of the displacement of our tribal community, the accumulation of fuels, climate change, all of those colliding, and we were seeing change on the landscape, an increase in tree mortality, some larger fires, but there was generally a feeling that we could still get our arms around the problem. In 2012 to 2016, California experienced one of the driest and hottest periods in state history. And with that came a beetle epidemic and a tree mortality crisis. And we ultimately had about 150 million trees die. It's important to note, too, that these weren't just any trees, really hit our largest pines. And those of you, and it was disproportionately in the Southern Sierra. I'm looking at Supervisor McCauley. Anyone who lived in the Southern Sierra at that time, really on an almost daily basis, we could watch the mortality advance across the landscape. And I think that it really was just an eye-opening experience at the pace at which really landscape transformation could happen. And then on the heels of that, really just a few years later, we were seeing some of the larger fires, Rim Fire, King Fire, but then we had the 2020 and 2021 wildfires, where over 6.5 million acres burned in California. A lot of that at high severity. Here in Trinity County, this is obviously familiar to all of you, and we were watching our forested landscapes transform. And I think it was a wake-up call that these mantra of pace and scale, what we were going to have to do and how we were going to have to respond as we watched this landscape scale transformation happen in such a short amount of time. And I think the state the state did respond. I don't even want to say I think. In 2019, we saw the development of the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. And this was a recognition that projects didn't just materialize out of nowhere, that there was a lot of partnership building, planning, design that went into the development and identification of projects, and that we, as a state, wanted to support that effort. So we did that through the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. In 2021, the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force was formed, and that was an evolution from the Tree Mortality Task Force. Anyone that went to Tuolumne County a couple months ago, I think there was over 500 people at the last task force meeting, so it really has become a place for federal and state and local partners to come together. S&C also responded. In 2022, we developed and released our landscape investment strategy, and that was a framework for how we could start to think about and respond to the need to work at a landscape scale, and how we could functionally try to find efficiencies in how we funded those projects to really increase that scale and pace of work. And then with that, we also published our landscape grant pilot program concept and awarded a pilot grant to the Healthy El Dorado Partnership, in partnership with CAL FIRE and the Forest Service, to do restoration work in the Crystal Basin, along with some recreation upgrades. And so then in 2024, the climate bond passed. S&C received about $45 million in funds specifically to, let's see if I could find the words, but specifically to fund resilience project at a landscape scale, and fund for the forest collaboratives that were doing that work. And so using that funding, and then based on a lot of the lessons learned from our Healthy El Dorado grant, we developed our landscape grant program guidelines, which is what we'll be presenting today. So there's a little bit of history. Okay. I also want to note that our partners responded as well. So they were watching this landscape grant unfold, watching the ways that the state was responding, and really started to develop collaborative groups and identify landscapes where they wanted to work in advance and develop and advance portfolios of project to advance resilience at a landscape scale. So here you can see the change in what we call ready landscapes in just 3 years. And we'll talk more about what we mean by readiness and the specific criteria associated with that. But essentially, what it means are collaborative groups that have an identified landscape and have the capacity and the projects to really advance resilience across at a landscape scale. And you can see that we've gone from just a few landscapes in 2023 to really pretty comprehensive coverage in the region. And then a bunch of those white areas also have collaborative groups that are working their way towards that readiness status. Before I dive too deeply, or before we dive too deeply into the guidelines, I think it's also worth taking a moment to just note that there's a lot of enthusiasm. We're very excited about this landscape grant program, but that S&C really wants to emphasize that we are continuing to support our partners wherever they are in that readiness trajectory. So we still have our regional forest and fire capacity program, where we're supporting partnerships and organizations to build capacity, form these collaboratives, develop these project portfolios. We obviously have our local assistance grants, our wildfire and forest health grants, our record tourism grants. So we can continue to fund organizations to do these, projects that are ready now, and we can continue to work on the ground. And then the landscape grant program is sort of the top tier of where we are hoping to find collaboratives to do entire portfolios of projects. And when we look at that readiness map with all of these different colored polygons, it's sort of easy to forget what that actually means. And I think just remembering that each one of those pretty colored blobs represents a collaborative group that has developed a really comprehensive strategic portfolio of projects, or sometimes one very large project um, across these landscapes. And these are just illustrating some examples of what these collaborative groups have done. And so, what this is showing is that our partners are ready to act and they are ready to advance projects as if we can make the funding available to them. And that's a message that we want to convey. It's a message that's important for us to know, but also a message that we want to pass on to our other funding partners and make them aware that, we have the groups and the organizational capacity and the projects that are ready to get implemented. Okay. And with our landscape grant program, like I said, our goal is to fund collaboratives to work across large landscapes to implement coordinated portfolios that improve forest health, reduce wildfire risk, and strengthen collaborative and community protection projects. And then Luke is going to dive into the actual details of the guidelines.
Details of the nuts and bolts. Yeah, okay. So the nuts and bolts start out with what makes the landscape grant program different from S&C's other grant programs. And like Sarah said, it targets forest collaboratives and will fund a portfolio of projects. And what we mean by that is a group of projects that, when you consider them all together, they move a landscape towards resilience. The third is that funding will be through a block grant to an organization that represents the collaborative, or if it's more efficient, we can make multiple grants to multiple organizations within the collaborative. But the block grant flexibility is one of the elements of this elements of this program that makes it so we can fund projects at different phases of readiness. So planning and implementation together. And so a block grant can fund multiple projects, and and we're looking at the portfolio. We're looking at moving all the projects together. So if there's one element that just needs a little bit of S&C funding, funding it through a block grant makes it easier than coming to us for a small amount of money. The fourth is that more money. We anticipate making 4 to 5 grants in the $8 to $12 million range for a total of $45 million awarded through this program. The evaluation is in 3 phases. I'll go into each of the 3 phases, so I know you can't really read the text, but the idea is to use information that S&C already has in phases 1 and 2, because we've worked really closely with these collaboratives, oftentimes since their founding. Area representatives and partnership and community support staff are deeply embedded in the region and work very closely. So phases 1 and 2 will use our internal, using information that we already have, and then we're funneling it down into phase 3. So phase 1 is to identify the ready landscapes. Phase 2 is to evaluate the strength of the partnerships and the collaboratives. And the third phase is to assess the impact of the specific projects in the portfolio. So the goal is to fund the strongest collaboratives with the best projects. And again, we're not saying that all projects need to be developed through strong collaboration. There are other grant programs that where projects are developed in different ways. But for the landscape grant program, projects need to be developed collaboratively and tied to a landscape level plan. So diving into the phases, the first phase of what defines an investment-ready landscape has 4 attributes. First, there's a clearly defined landscape. Second, a collaboratively developed and prioritized list of projects. Third, the collaborative has demonstrated that they have the capacity to implement large projects. And readiness to act. And we define readiness to act as a supply of shovel-ready projects, particularly $10 million in projects that are ready to implement immediately. And again, this is an internal evaluation based on staff experience working with the collaboratives and information that we've collected through the regional priority plan reporting. Phase 2 evaluates the strength of the collaborative, and it's also based on information that we already have. So a strong collaborative has a rigorous landscape assessment, broad-based participation, a clear decision-making process, institutional capacity and resilience. What we mean by that is that all of the capacity to implement isn't concentrated on one individual entity within the collaborative. There's a broad group of organizations that have the capacity to implement. Meaningful tribal engagement and alignment with state and local priorities. We anticipate there will be 7 to 10 top scoring collaboratives that will advance to phase 3. And phase 3 is an interview where the S&C scoring team meets with members of the collaborative to understand and evaluate the benefits of the project portfolio. Phases 1 and 2 evaluated the collaborative, and phase 3 focuses on the projects. So these are the 6 big buckets of the criteria we'll use, and they evaluate the benefits of the portfolio and the likelihood of success. The criteria are very similar to what we use for evaluating local assistance grants, but the process is an interview. And again, this is an interview with an organization and that represents a collaborative that S&C has been working very closely with, often since their founding. So we'll each come to this interview with a deep understanding of one another. So for the past year, Sarah has been going around to the collaboratives, answering questions and presenting the landscape grant program. In February of this year, S&C formally released the guidelines for a 30-day public comment period. We received 19 letters. There was a lot of excitement and support, and also recommendations. We considered the comments individually, but to summarize them, these are the 3 most common themes. clarify the evaluation process. This is a new way of SNC doing grants, and our partners wanted clarity on the process. Second, expand and clarify the eligible activities. For example, road work. If it's integral to a forest health project, can funding be used for road work? Would be one example of clarify the eligible activities. And 3, clearly define shovel readiness. So what level of permitting needs to be completed? Because shovel readiness comes into the evaluation of the first step, identifying the ready landscapes. There was a lot of course, partners want to be on the ready landscape map. So what do we need to get there? And shovel readiness was one of the criteria. In response to the comments, we updated the guidelines, developed a list of frequently asked questions, and clarified our supporting material that's online. So next steps. If the board approves these guidelines, we will immediately start the internal phase 1 and 2 evaluations based on the information that we currently have about the readiness of the collaboratives and their strength. We anticipate phase 3 interviews will be later in the summer and in the fall, and block grant award recommendations we anticipate will be made in December, with project-specific recommendations at board meetings in 2027. Staff recommends the board approve the landscape grant program guidelines, authorize $45 million in Proposition 4 funding that was appropriated to SNC in 2024-2025 for the program, and authorize staff to implement the program.
All right. Thank you. I'm excited about this program. I think it's going to be a great way to get some significant dollars out there quickly and make it easier for projects to get implemented versus the project approach, which has its place, don't get me wrong, but I think this is an exciting effort, and that collaborative approach really seems to make a lot of sense to me.